The program this afternoon is timely for many reasons. As we race through the first 100 days of a new presidency marked by significant attention to religious issues, Shaun's book offers rare insights into one of the most extraordinary presidential campaigns in American history, the Kennedy-Nixon race of the 1960s, when America chose for the first time a Catholic president. As we saw in this most recent campaign, the religious lives of candidates still give rise to substantial curiosity and misinformation. The most recent poll was still that about 10% of Americans thought that Barack Obama was a Muslim. They also serve as an interesting barometric window into the religious attitudes of the American populace. It is now my pleasure to introduce Shaun Casey and Chester Gillis, who will moderate today's discussion. Shaun Casey is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics and Director of the National Capital Semester for Seminarians at Wesley Theological Center here in Washington, D.C. Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. He has served as a visiting fellow at the Center for American Progress and as a religious outreach advisor to the Obama campaign. His research interests include ethics in international affairs, the public implications of religious belief, and the intersection of religion and politics. He has written on the ethics of the war in Iraq, as well as the role of religion in American presidential politics. His recent book, The Making of a Catholic President, Kennedy versus Nixon, 1960, was published in January 2009 by Oxford University Press. He is a graduate of the Harvard Divinity School with a Master's of Divinity degree and a Doctorate of Theology in Religion and Society. He also earned a Master of Public Administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, with a concentration in international security. He earned a BA from Abilene Christian University. He is a member of the American Academy of Religion and serves on its Committee on the Public Understanding of Religion. Chester Gillis is a member of the Department of Theology here at Georgetown, where he holds the Amaturo Chair in Catholic Studies and currently serves as Interim Dean of Georgetown College. He is the founding director of the program on church and interreligious dialogue within the Berkeley Center. Professor Gillis has served on the faculty of Georgetown since 1988, was chair of the Department of Theology from 2001 to 2006, and director of the Doctor of Liberal Studies degree from 2006 to 2008. Gillis's research interests include comparative religion and contemporary Roman Catholicism. The author of a number of books in these areas, he is also co-editor of a series, Religion and Politics, from Columbia University Press. He is currently working on a new, among his duties as dean, he is currently working on a new edition of his Roman Catholicism in America and a book on interreligious marriage, tentatively titled Two Shall Become as One, Interreligious Marriage in America. He is frequently consulted by the media about contemporary issues in religion, especially about Roman Catholicism, or any time a book says anything that is controversial, is on television and radio. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Shaun Casey and Chester Gillis.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thank you, Chet, for serving as host today. This is a wonderful opportunity for me, and I am humbled to be here with you. Let me just put a plug in for the Berkeley Center. I mean, what you guys are doing is extraordinary. You've gone from 0 to 60 here in maybe 3 or 4 weeks. But the range of programming at the Berkeley Center is really quite remarkable. And it's a jewel for those of us who are in the field at the intersection of religion, politics, and public life and international affairs. It's really, it's an unparalleled institution. Thanks to you and thanks to Georgetown for the wisdom in establishing the Berkeley Center. I'm just going to take a few minutes and run through a couple of 3 points about the book, and then Chet's going to get up and we'll interact after Chet. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because it's such a fascinating juxtaposition of arguably two of the most brilliant political minds our Republicans ever produced, Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. Love them or hate them, you still have to walk away saying these guys were two of the most brilliant, successful politicians at the presidential level our country ever produced. Richard Nixon, for instance, was on the national ticket 5 times and won 4 of the 5 times. And I haven't done the math on that, but I suspect he's unparalleled with that number of victories and that number of times at the top of the national ticket. What I see too, though, in addition to these two brilliant minds going toe-to-toe, was of course one of the closest electoral outcomes in the history of the Republic. Essentially 112,000 votes, and they separated Kennedy from Nixon. Kennedy ended up winning the state of Texas by 45,000 votes, so he almost got half of his margin from one state alone. And in the book I tell a story which I won't bore you with today, but essentially how a Southern Baptist editor won the state of Texas for John Kennedy in the last week of the election, which is a very interesting sort of sub-story to the whole grand narrative. But this was the election where American anti-Catholicism perhaps had its greatest, most recent, intense, organized, coherent spasm at the presidential level in American politics. I was amazed at the end of the research of this book how well defined, how well funded, how well organized Protestant anti-Catholic forces were in that 1960 election. We've really not seen anything quite like it since in our politics. In fact, it's hard to imagine we would see something on a scale being repeated in the contemporary political environment. But at the end of the day, after 5 years of writing and research, I still come away amazed, not only at the depth and pervasiveness of Protestant anti-Catholicism, I'm also amazed at how well the forces in the Republican Party organized those folks to oppose Kennedy simply because of his Catholic stance. Secondly, I call the rise of the religious right a central part of this drama. I refer to this as the larva stage of the religious right in American politics. The folks who gathered together to oppose Kennedy in a systematic way are in fact the same people who by the late 70s were helping form the moral majority. Folks like Billy Graham, folks like the National Association of Evangelicals, even Norman Vincent Peale, all worked together and were coordinated by the Nixon campaign to the extent they needed any help being coordinated. And it's astonishing to see how at that early age, in 1960, we see the really beginning points of the organization of what we now call the religious right in the United States. Most folks don't realize they were organizing together at that early date in 1960. I was able to find a lot of new archival research to show that they were in it up to their eyeballs trying to oppose Kennedy because of his Catholicism. And you have to recall, it wasn't clear that Kennedy was going to be the nominee until the actual June convention in Los Angeles in 1960. Even as late as that date, people thought the convention was going to give the nomination either to Lyndon Johnson or perhaps to Hubert Humphrey, and Kennedy would be rewarded with the vice presidential slot. So if you're Richard Nixon and you're trying to gear up for the general campaign, Nixon himself probably didn't believe Kennedy was going to be the nominee until he saw him giving the acceptance speech in June of 1960. So Nixon did not have a lot of time to organize the forces against the Catholic hand. He proved to be quite successful once he did that. I found a lot of new archival material, and I think to the extent, as E.J. Dionne told me, there's news value in this book. It is that I discovered that Nixon was helping to organize these conservative, Christian, anti-Catholic Protestants around the country. Kennedy had an informant inside Nixon's campaign who told him of those activities. And that sent a bombshell through the Kennedy campaign when they realized and came to know the extent of the network it was building against him. The Houston speech, which we all know and celebrate as this landmark of Christian, or really of religious freedom, was a speech given in fear, because a week before Norman Vincent Peale had held a meeting here in Washington, D.C. at the Mayflower Hotel, working with Billy Graham to organize literally thousands of Protestants, liberal, moderate, and conservative Protestants, against him. And the Kennedy campaign felt like they had to respond publicly to the threat that Peale and Graham posed to them. And so they reluctantly accepted the bid to give the Houston speech, which now turns out to be kind of the one thing we remember from that campaign, the eloquent speech that Kennedy gave. Finally, actually, next to last, I also discovered that Kennedy himself had a political mentor inside the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. The extent of which, had Protestants known it at the time, it would have confirmed their absolute worst fears that Kennedy was being controlled by somebody in the hierarchy. His relationship was with Bishop John Wright, later Cardinal Wright, who later went to Rome, but at that point he was Bishop of Pittsburgh, had been a diocesan priest in Boston when Kennedy came back from World War II. And they had developed a relationship in about 1946, and both of their careers took off almost simultaneously. Under Wright's tutelage, Kennedy in 58 and 59 did a listening tour of prominent anti-Catholic Protestants in the country, where he would go to them and say, "You're a Democrat, you like my politics, you think I'm young and strong and vigorous, but you're going to vote against me because I'm a Catholic. Help me understand that." So he met with folks like Bromley Oxnam, who was the closest thing to an American Protestant pope. He was one of the leading bishops of the Methodist Church of the day. He met with similar folks in the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, and he even met twice, interestingly enough, with the president of the Mormon Church in Salt Lake City. And each time he would come back to Pittsburgh and debrief with Bishop Wright and explain what he had heard. He and Bobby both came back. And one of the things that the Bishop Wright said was that Robert's questions were so much more penetrating and interesting than John's questions were to the these folks. John wanted to know, how can we placate them? Can we build them a road? Can we get them a piece of legislation that will satisfy them? And Bobby was much more interested in what made them tick, theologically, philosophically, and intellectually. I was very fortunate to receive the first copy of Bishop Wright's oral history, which is about a 55-page single-spaced document which he donated to the John F. Kennedy Library. I was the beneficiary of getting that released to me. I was the first scholar to see that. So there's some new archival research here. Finally, I'll be accurate this time. I'm intrigued by the parallels between the 1960 campaign and the contemporary environment. I literally turned in the final edits on this book, and a week later I joined the Obama campaign in July of 2008 in Chicago. And so the parallels were always on my mind as I traveled across this country during that election. Let me just give you a couple. One of the parallels is both of them as candidates faced tremendous weaknesses as candidates because of their religion. Kennedy's Catholicism was a clear disadvantage to him. George Gallup showed in '59, the more that Americans knew he was Catholic, the lower his polling numbers went. By the same token, if in 2005 I had told you the Democratic nominee for President of the United States in 2008 is going to be African American, his middle name is going to be Hussein, and even after he gets elected, 10% of the American population thinks he was Muslim at some point in his life, what percentage of, say, the Protestant Christian vote do you think he's going to get in 2008? I would have said maybe 8%. So Obama had a set of weaknesses with respect to religion. Kennedy did the same. Unlike a lot of Democrats in between Kennedy and Obama, Obama embraced those problems. He applied what I would call a form of technical rationality to them, which I think Kennedy did similarly, and they hired staff. They talked to people. They made speeches directly addressing the religious dynamics in the campaign, and they didn't flee in the face of what looked like very, very hard, almost unsolvable kinds of questions. So the technical rationality, the direct action, and the public rhetoric. We will remember the Philadelphia speech that Barack Obama gave on race. I would also say that speech was about religion just as much as it was about race, because it was in response to Jeremiah Wright. In both cases, Kennedy and Obama responded by taking their message to the public and not fleeing, and making what were arguably the two most powerful speeches of their respective campaigns, because they knew the stakes were so high and their resources were so deep that they felt confident they could address them. And ultimately, I think after the 2008 campaign, we're going to remember that Philadelphia speech after we forget many, many of the details of the last 12 months. I'll stop there, Chet.
Terrific. I think I'll work right from here, Shaun. Thank you. That last part was something I'm going to segue into my comments. But let me say, I met Shaun for the first time, actually it was in January, you may remember. It was over a glass of wine at the reception at the American Academy of Religion committee meetings in Atlanta. And we started the conversation, and he told me, I just finished this manuscript in this book on making the Catholic president. And on that Monday, I came home and I ordered the book. And so I had, when Michael asked me to do this, I said, oh, sure, I have it right here, I'm reading this. And let me say, it's a terrific book. It's really a superb book. Now, Shaun is an ethicist, and you could easily mistake him for a historian if you read this book. And think, here's somebody who did all this archival research that any historian would be proud of, and also writes with a terrific pen, and also weaves a great story. So I really recommend the book to you to read. It's the kind of thing that is, I can't say what a page turner, because it's not that kind of suspense in it, but it's elegantly written, and it's so finely detailed which I really appreciated. You got it right, and you did the work to get it right. I can see why 5 years of research went into the book. You should be very proud of it. I think it's a superb piece, and I think it's going to have a long shelf life and an impact in the field. So that's my first comment of praise. Now I have a few critical things to say, not about you or the book. Just as any scholar should do, we need to engage you in some conversation about specifics in the book. And I told Shaun, don't worry, I'm going to throw softballs, and I can sometimes go for the juggler, but this is not that kind of environment. You're at Georgetown, we're a very friendly place. Let me tell you. But let me raise a few things in the book. On page 20, I'm going to be very specific, on page 21, I have all my little stickies here, but also I can read the text. You say, in the middle, I'm going to quote it for everybody here, since you don't have the book, but you'll be buying it soon. This is Kennedy replying to some of his critics, where they say, there are many Americans that believe the basic philosophy of Catholicism runs counter to the many basic freedoms of our nation. That's the thing. Kennedy responds, while my principal political objective at the present time is re-election to the United States Senate for the state of Massachusetts, I was very much disturbed to learn that you feel that any person would be denied public office because of his religious beliefs, whatever that might be. I had certainly thought by this time, given our broad educational base, individuals who at other times might, out of ignorance, be misinformed about various religious faiths and their application to everyday life, would now be better informed. Now this is, again, in 1960, or 59 or 60. When you take that, and then if you turn to page, page 83. Oh, let me hold on to that. I'll get to the other pages in a minute. When I read that quotation from Kennedy, I thought, at that time, I thought maybe religion was over as a part, and Shaun just indicated for Obama it wasn't. But when I read that, I thought another speech during the 2008 campaign, and that was Mitt Romney. Someone who had to explain his religion as the Church of Latter-day Saints, as a Mormon, to a wider public in a very high-stakes speech as well, and in my view, relatively unsuccessful. Brilliantly executed and all, but unsuccessful on a theological point of view. That I don't think he delved into the theology of Mormonism. Maybe he was afraid to, or maybe it was too complex to explain it in that kind of a venue, and I think in a sense it hurt him. So what Kennedy faced has not gone away at all in our culture, or in our politics. Not for 1 minute, it seems to me. And that was one poignant example of that. I think perhaps you would agree, maybe you want to comment on that?
Yeah.
Before I go on.
Yeah, I think what links the two is Americans' fear of secrecy. I mean, I think back, I grew up in a small town, Mid-South, city of 25,000, with one Catholic church. I grew up low church Protestant. We viewed, I was born in 1957, I remember the early 60s, we low church Protestants viewed Catholics as eccentrics, exotic. Your priests dressed up, your church buildings were so ornate, and there was almost this European sense. In fact, it was the Roman Catholic Church, after all. So there was this sense of, there are layers of meaning and secrecy here that as low church Protestants, we don't have the ability to perceive. That, I think, fed a lot of Protestant suspicion. Romney had the same problem, because in some ways the Mormon Church is today's analog to the Catholic Church in the mid-century, in that you can't just walk in to a Mormon tabernacle and get a tour of the whole place. And no one will sit down with you, the outsider, and say, okay, this is Mormon belief from A to Z. There are no theologies of Mormonism that you can buy at Barnes & Noble to tell you the whole story. There are layers of membership, layers of secrecy, if you will. And if you're Mitt Romney, you've got to overcome that. And he can't get up and say, well, look, here's the pamphlet, the 25 things all Mormons believe. My campaign's going to hand it out. You see it. We don't do bad things in secret. And so I would agree, we still have this fear of religious secrecy and esoteric. And so if a candidate comes from what's perceived to be a non-mainstream group, you still have huge problems with that. I completely agree.
Exactly. Another point, and I'll get back to the politics of that too in relation to religions, but on page 39 at the bottom, This is about 4 sentences from the bottom of the page. It's referring to Christianity in Crisis and Christian Century, two large Protestant publications that are popular coffee table publications, but fairly widely read. That's my question. You say these two publications engaged in a heated debate over the desirability of a Kennedy presidency and set the tone for huge segments of Protestant America. Nothing short of the fate of the election was at stake. And that, I was wondering if you somehow overstated the case there when later on page 52, at the bottom you say, the 4 C's conference, this was alluding to a certain conference that happened, demonstrated that the intellectual world of these liberal journalists and theologians was small. They knew one another and were in contact often. And I saw kind of a differential there between this huge influence of these relatively small journals. I mean, Christian Century and Christianity in Crisis. I'm not sure if I asked all of you to read your copy of Christianity in Crisis this week about Christian Century, how many people would raise their hand here? So how influential were they, or was it the small coterie of people at the top?
I think it was both. The readership of Christian Century, circulation in those days was 40 or 50,000. It was primarily clergy. So to the extent, I mean, the Protestant world, if you wanted to have influence, you had the ear of the clergy. And the Christian Century was, less so today, but certainly in that era, the intellectual flagship journal of Protestant clergy in America. So you could take that figure, say 50,000 clergy, or let's say it was 30,000 clergy. Multiply that by a factor of 100, assuming that each congregation had about 100 people in it, and suddenly you're talking about potentially millions of auditors who were reading that publication. They were sort of the sole source of theologically interpreted political news for the Protestant world that day. But when you looked at the stable of writers for those two, it was really a very small club of intellectuals, and that's the second point, is that they were Christianity in Crisis was New York-based. It was dominated by Union Theological Seminary, Reinhold Niebuhr, John Bennett, Henry Van Dusen. And they caught the early ecumenical wave. I mean, they knew the John Courtney Murrays, they knew the Gustav Weigels of the sort of northeastern Catholic intellectual world. They were part of that nascent ecumenical conversation that's going on. Christian Century is Chicago-based. It has a long history of anti-Catholicism going back to its founder, C.C. Morrison. So it really, you get the difference then between the northeastern Protestant world and the midwestern Protestant world. But I think they were heavily influential. I mean, when I started ministry in the 1980s in the Protestant world, I knew clergy who subscribed to both magazines and still read them even in the 80s and 90s religiously. Christianity in Crisis is now defunct.
Right, I know, exactly. Another point I want to make from the book is, I've thought about it, but it's a wider question. It's on page 115, and I'm going to quote from it, and I'll stop quoting directly from the book and raise some issues more broadly. You say, Archer was sure that the Catholic hierarchy had told Kennedy to do whatever was necessary to get elected. And then a quotation. The Roman Catholic hierarchy has a box full of demands which violate our Constitution and give a special privilege to them alone. The presidency in the hands of the Catholics will further this legislative program. So the sense is that if you have a Catholic president, he's going to be taking his orders from Rome, and therefore it's like Al Smith. When Al Smith was not elected President of the United States in 1928, the governor of New York, popular governor and a Catholic, and some think it was anti-Catholicism that resulted in his non-election. There's a famous law that afterwards Al Smith sent a one-word telegram to the Pope, unpack. But the irony of this, and in that situation, I know there's a fear that Catholics will be controlled by someone else. Now, the irony of that in 1960, and you compare it to today, when you look at where Catholics are leaning in certain circles of us, including ecclesiastical circles and hierarchical circles, there's a great favoritism for the Bush administration, for example. If you're not a Republican and you're not voting for the Bush administration, you're not anti-abortion, you're really not following the agenda that we want to follow. And this was very much in play in the Obama campaign, as you know. Many bishops opposed Obama, despite certain policies that were very progressive on social justice, that Reverend Navarro and other Catholic doctrines were supported, partially, not partially, almost exclusively on the pro-life or in their view, anti-life agenda. So there's kind of an irony here, where here we want Catholics, some Catholic hierarchical figures, want people to vote for the Protestant Republican, because he will listen to them more than the Catholic who is running, and I think in the case not only of Obama as a policy, but John Kerry. John Kerry ran into a situation where here's Kennedy getting advice from Catholic priests and bishops and all of that. Here's John Kerry trying to distance himself in some ways, or the church is distancing itself from him as a Catholic. Differently saying, we're proud to have a Catholic be elected, this is a wonderful thing. No, you're not the kind of Catholic we want to be elected. Do you see those parallels today? And the irony of what's happening?
Oh, absolutely. Let me take what Kennedy's response was. He said, let's talk about public policy. And I'm going to take stands that seemingly contravene what my church would want. He said, I'm not going to appoint an ambassador to the Vatican, which had come up earlier right after World War II. He said that I'm not going to give federal money to parochial schools. And if countries come to us and want foreign aid for birth control measures, I will decide whether to do that or not on the merits of the request, not on the basis of Catholic doctrine. He then challenged his Republican and Protestant critics to say, show me a political issue, show me a policy issue where I'm going to take a cue from, or I had even in the past taken a cue from a Catholic prelate telling me to vote this way against my own political leanings. And so he threw down, some people tried to pick up that gauntlet and tried to go back in his record, and there were a couple of issues where there was controversy. But he denied that he would take a phone call from a bishop who said, change your vote on this issue because your bishop is telling you to. But then there was this wonderful debate about, well, it didn't matter whatever he had done in the past. That if he wanted to maintain his status in the church, if the bishop made the call and he wanted to stay in the good graces of the church, he would have to do that. And he would have to lie now to get elected to be in the position to take that phone call from the Vatican. So there's really no answer to that rationally. Now, it is ironic today that in the current ethos, and certainly I saw this on the inside of the campaign, there were bishops who supported Barack Obama personally. He would tell the campaign, I am with you, just don't ask me that involved. And they did tamp down, in some cases, some potential flare-ups in their own diocese, where there might be a priest or two who wanted to get up and tell their congregation, you have to vote for McCain. I know of some instances where I think bishops tamped that down and cut that off before it came to a head. To me, that's that's one of the major changes in the Catholic Church today, is that for good or for ill, there's no conversation space left over, as we tried to talk about, abortion reduction in the United States. It seems to me, what we tried to say as a campaign was, as a Catholic voter today, you really face sort of two choices on the so-called pro-life issue. You could buy into a party of rhetoric that was rhetorically pro-life, but actually pursued economic policies that made it harder for a woman with an unintended pregnancy to choose to bring that pregnancy to term. Or you could embrace a set of economic policies that would empower more women in that situation of reduced means for an unintended pregnancy to bring that pregnancy to full term. We felt like we could go to some evidence out of the second Clinton administration where we had economic growth, we had reductions in poverty, we had unemployment going down, and correspondingly that was the largest decrease in the rate of abortion since Roe v. Wade. We try to make a pragmatic, if you will, John Courtney Murray type of argument that says not only do you have a moral stance, but you've got to ask yourself pragmatically which legislation gets you closer to your moral goal. We made a case, I think it had some resonance with moderate Catholics. I'm not sure we flipped any Catholic bishops along the way to that argument. But it's tough now in the current environment, I think, to be where Obama is, trying to make significant reductions in the abortion rate in America, not by criminalizing it, but by actually empowering women to be able to make that choice to keep their child. But that also sparked a pretty heated reaction from certain groups.
And even in the Catholic world, the faithful citizenship document that the bishops put out, which was before the elections to inform the consciences of conscientious Catholics on issues, was actually quite well balanced, I thought. It was quite a well balanced piece, so that you really could have voted for Barack or you could have voted for McCain by the virtue of this very document. But that document among the American Catholic bishops was very controversial, as you know.
That's
And
right.
many, many bishops were very angry that that document actually got out, because they thought they surrendered that particular territory, particularly on stem cell research and abortion, ceded it to a larger range of issues, and therefore there was wiggle room in a sense. But I think we know that now.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and what happened is, I think the McCain campaign quoted their favorite paragraphs out of it. The Obama campaign quoted our favorite paragraphs out of it. And I think that angered a lot of conservative bishops who really wanted to kind of get a single message.
They wanted a single issue.
Right.
And my penultimate question comes from, and I'll quote from it one more time, this is on page 141, but since the history of the Republic was full of examples of faithful Catholics serving in elected and appointed offices from the local level all the way to the Senate and Supreme Court with no record of Vatican interference and manipulation. I want to challenge that a little bit and say, it's not Vatican influence and manipulation, but I do want to say that the American Catholic bishops, in the 1960s certainly, but today even more so, better organized, do have a lobbying policy. They do have a lobbying agenda. They are trying to influence public policy. I know, I was with bishops recently, one of whom had just been at the White House the week before.
Right.
And it was not to have a courtesy visit and have tea. It was to instruct the administration exactly about the kind of policy they should be pursuing on certain moral categories.
Right.
And as you know, the USCCB maintains lobbyists for their purposes. So it may not be directly coming from the Vatican, but clearly the Church is very much trying to influence public policy and administrations.
Oh, well, there's no doubt.
Proactively.
There's no doubt, but I think what I was trying to argue in this case was, Kennedy often said, show me where I had reversed myself on policy, where I walked away from a historic democratic position to embrace a Catholic endorsed position, because I was leveraged by the Vatican.
Well,
The environment's completely changed now.
but you take Rick Santorum, for example. I mean, I think Rick
Right.
Santorum took a lot of his clues from the Roman Catholic Church, very much about his policy.
Oh, there's no doubt.
Very, very much. So I don't think it's completely accurate to say that, no record of influence, not Vatican influence, but of manipulation. I do think that deeply.
I can't. I can't see my quote.
It's page 141, the second to last paragraph right at the bottom. And Kennedy argued this all the time.
Yeah.
I've never really changed, I've never been influenced by the church in that way,
Right.
but I think that maybe
Well, I
isn't
think
true to
the
some
argument is,
degree.
I mean, the guy who made the argument there is Harold Oppenday,
Right.
who was one of the sort of the flagship evangelicals. He pastored the historic Park Street Church in Boston. Was one of the big Billy Graham founder, and his charge was that Catholics were going to always be vulnerable to the threat. That I'm going to excommunicate you, Chet, if you don't change your vote on this. And what Kennedy said was there were no historical examples lying around in 1960 where that had actually happened.
Right.
Now, so I think it's an accurate historical statement by 1960, but in today's environment, there's a lot of political pressure.
Probably if we asked Catherine Sebelius about this.
She would have a different view.
Probably. have a different view.
And that's what's changed, I think,
Yeah.
is that in those days, there wasn't a lot of dissent on so-called Catholic issues, because the range of Catholic issues, frankly, was smaller than it is today. But certainly abortion and stem cell research have been so prominent that there's tremendous amount of pressure from Catholic Democrats.
My last point goes right back to the direct figure of the book, Kennedy, and I must say, I take the privilege of, since I'm the editor of this series on religion and politics for Columbia, I have an early manuscript of the book that's not out yet, so this is an unfair question, because you couldn't possibly have read this from someone else, but it will be out soon, I'm sure you'll be reading it. It's a scholar named Thomas Carty, I don't know if you know him. Yeah, you know his work. This is a new piece he just wrote. And you said at the end, the impact of his faith, kind of defending Kennedy, saying, okay, he was largely sanitizing his faith in certain decisions publicly, and he divorced himself from the church in that regard, intentionally so that he wouldn't look like he was a pawn of the church. But you said the impact of his faith may not have been overwhelming, but it was not negligible either. Now, so in a way, you're defending Kennedy as a kind of faithful Catholic. He was a regular churchgoer and all that. Now, there's a number of people now, Mark Massa, Hardy, a range of other scholars who really see Kennedy very differently. They don't see him as the kind of faithful, loyal Catholic. They see him as someone who, out of rote or out of discipline, went to church regularly, was a faithful Catholic in that sense, but on deeper issues was probably not as Catholic as many would want. Many might criticize and say he could have been more Catholic and more proactive on his Catholic faith. it's probably going to be an ongoing debate about really who was the real Catholic Kennedy. You know, was it a kind of? It's a little bit like I remember seeing Bill Clinton, it's not a criticism, often on the news coming out of the church here every Sunday.
Right.
Ironically, I found out George Bush never went to church.
That's right.
I had no idea of that, but you had the impression he was always in church. I have the impression. I mean,
Yeah.
his religious language,
Right.
the evangelical thing was
Right.
clearly, it was very public for him, but he wasn't a churchgoer. Now, Kennedy was a regular churchgoer, we know that, but did that really influence him? Was he really deeply directed by that, or not?
No. I mean,
That's a simple answer. That's it.
well, the truth is, when it comes to public figures in their faith, we sort of have two boxes. Either we want them to be St. Francis, or we think they're Machiavelli. Okay. Now, I have been a Protestant pastor, and 99.9% of my parishioners were neither St. Francis nor Machiavelli. Okay. I think it's true of Catholics as well. Most Catholics are neither St. Francis nor Machiavelli when it comes to their faith. They're in that huge intellectual space and theological space in between. One of what I found to be most helpful was, in fact, the document, the oral history from Bishop Rocket, who baptized some of the Kennedy larger clan and knew Kennedy from about 46 to 63. Now, obviously, he's got a perspective and he's got his own set of biases. He said Kennedy was not an intellectual. He was not a Catholic intellectual, but he had a deathly fear of dying outside of the church. And he called him a Boston Catholic, which was the title that was also what John Cogley called him. Cogley was his advisor. Cogley edited Commonweal magazine. And by what they meant a Boston Catholic was, they're not reading Thomas Aquinas on their Saturdays off. Okay. They're not reading papal encyclicals. Rerum Novarum would have been completely unknown to them. And yet they did go to Mass every week. They participated in the feast days when the parishes would have special breakfasts and dinners. They were always there. Wright said Kennedy took to the Catholic Church like a fish to water as a political institution. He moved in as a political operator very naturally. Now, did he consult his local parish priest when deciding to launch the Bay of Pigs invasion? No. It would have never occurred to him to do that. That's not what he looked to the church for. So he wasn't Eugene McCarthy. In fact, he hated Gene McCarthy. And Bobby Kennedy hated Gene McCarthy with a double passion, because McCarthy passed himself off as truly a Catholic political intellectual. And they wanted nothing to do with that. They found that just too fastidious for them.
But some would argue that Bobby was more principled than Jack.
Well, I think that's right.
And deeply rooted in certain ethical domains of Catholicism.
I think that's right. And I think that as he grew older and his tragedies proliferated, he became more deeply a Catholic thinker. Okay, but when he's bumping up against Gene McCarthy in the 50s, he doesn't like what he sees. But you fast forward 10 years later, in the mid 60s, he does become, I think, much more deeply attached to his own faith. So I would say, I can't tell you where in that continuum John F. Kennedy is, but I can tell you I don't think he's completely secular, and he does have some Machiavellian tendencies. I mean, that's obviously very good. Cogley talked about what being a Boston Catholic meant was he was able to use power without Protestant guilt. and the key for him was what end is power exercised toward, much more a Thomistic sense of what is the telos towards which the application of power is being used. And Cogley argued, not that he read Thomas, but there's sort of a generic Catholic view that power can be used for justice and for good, and you may break some furniture along the way, and that's regrettable, but you can still use power towards good political and ethical ends. So I think this discussion is a very complicated one, but he clearly is not St. Francis, and anybody who would defend that thesis is clearly wrong. But the notion that he was purely secular or that he was purely Machiavellian in his religion, I don't think it counts for all the data that's out there. But obviously very complicated.
Protestants haven't captured the market on guilt, by the way. Catholics think you make a Catholic guilty once, should be guilty the rest of their life. So we're pretty good at that too. If Kennedy were alive today and run as a Catholic, do you think he'd have to have a different strategy from the one that he employed in 1960?
I think there's no doubt. And abortion would be the reason why. I mean, he would not have a Cardinal Cushing behind him. Cardinal Cushing, the Cardinal of Boston, who was in many ways his biggest Catholic cheerleader. It's inconceivable today to have a pro-choice Catholic running for the presidency and having such a public cheerleader as a cardinal. I mean, that's inconceivable to me today. So in that sense, he would have less support there. But ironically, interestingly enough, one of the other things that's flipped, though, is that the evangelicals who hated Kennedy, hated his Catholicism, now, that's not a problem. That's a non-issue. You know, in fact, in many ways, it's an advantage. If you're a pro-life Republican Catholic, that's going to open up doors for you in the evangelical world today. So that's flipped.
Yeah, very, very much. I mean, I think I agree with you completely that the evangelicals have found, sometimes I call them strange bedfellows, with the Catholics on a range of social issues, really, and ethical issues. Although on theological issues, they'd be quite distinctively different on hermeneutics, texts, traditions, interpretations.
Right.
But if it's on issues of ecology, where the evangelicals have recently moved in that direction, certainly on the life issues, and that's all the sides of life issues, including capital punishment and those ranges where many evangelicals are moving as well.
Yeah.
And on some other social policies, I think they'd be very much in favor of the Catholic candidate in some of these. But a certain kind of Catholic, not a Kennedy Catholic.
That's correct. A northeastern kind of traditional liberal Democrat, that's too good. But it's interesting to see. I mean, Sam Brownback is a very interesting case. I mean, I actually know somebody who worked for Brownback, and they had a very difficult time in Iowa because there the Republican Party is dominated by very conservative Protestants. And when you had a Huckabee and you had a Romney as alternatives, those conservative Christian Republicans did not migrate to Brownback because he converted from Methodism to Catholicism. And he could never really get over that, or in that little context.
Nixon really never got the religion piece, did he, in this campaign? He just never took advantage of or manipulated it to his favor. He didn't want to address it.
Well, at some level you got to feel for him because his problem was the flip side of Kennedy's. He saw Kennedy sucking Republican Catholics into the Democratic Party. And he tried to hold them in, but just couldn't do it. So his alternative is, how can I gin up anti-Catholicism among this vast Protestant world? And that's why he hired the operative and sent him out there to try to gin up. Now, the other part of the story is, too, that a lot of people don't want to talk about, is the depth of liberal Protestant anti-Catholicism in 1960. Americans United for Separation of Church and State, everybody knows that, right? What nobody knows is they were started as Protestants and other Americans United for Separation of Church and State. They were at the table with Graham and Peel and the National Association of Evangelicals working to defeat Kennedy in 1960. Now, Barry Lynn just doesn't want to hear that today because the Protestants, the evangelicals left that coalition in the early 70s. But Nixon felt like, if I get up and make a speech about why a Protestant can't vote for a Catholic, I'll get hammered. So he couldn't do that publicly. He had to go into a clandestine strategy. And it's not unlike what John McCain faced with respect to Barack Obama. He could have exploited Jeremiah Wright far more than he did. And it's to his great credit that he didn't take the low road. I never picked up a single whiff of the McCain campaign feeding, oh, he's really a Muslim line. That came from other parts of the culture. That did not come from the McCain campaign. He could have taken that option. And again, it's to McCain's credit that he didn't. I think Nixon did take that option. I think Nixon watered and fertilized those gardens secretly in 1960 to gin up that kind of Protestant anti-Catholicism. But he chose to make it clandestine. Although the classic line is, on Sunday night before the election, Nixon buys half an hour national TV time. And one of the lines in that is, I will fulfill my promise not to raise the religion of my opponent in this election. Okay, so it's one of those, it's beautiful, it's brilliant. He doesn't explicitly raise it as an attack, but to those who have ears to hear and eyes to see, he's saying, remember, this guy's Catholic, and if you're Protestant, you shouldn't vote. Very Nixon.
I've had the privilege of asking a lot of questions. Maybe some of you want to ask questions? Michael?
Well, thank you so much for coming.
This
has been a great conversation so far. I have two questions. One, Biden came here the morning of the inauguration and took communion and took the Eucharist in
Right.
Dahlgren Chapel. I don't think I followed the election pretty closely. It was never talked about that he was Roman Catholic. Does that mean that we're past it? That's the first question. The second question is, as a student of constitutional law, I'm struck by the inversion that sort of is obvious, which is there's no constitutional requirement that a person not be motivated by religion. There is a constitutional requirement that there is no religious test for public office. But practically speaking, it was what you described as sort of the direct inversion of that, which is I'm curious if anybody, in your research, if anybody was talking about that particular problem. Was anybody framing it around the constitutional prohibition on conducting religious tests? So,
In terms of your first question, it's interesting. I was in Evansville, Indiana, at the end of the campaign. At the end of the campaign, everybody gets sent out and planted for the last 3 weeks, and I was in the garden spot of Southern Indiana. I apologize if you're from Southern Indiana. But Biden came to town on All Saints Day and was late. The event was supposed to start at 9 o'clock, and he got up and told this great story. He said, I was out jogging this morning and with my wife, and my wife was ahead of me because I ended up walking. And a Catholic sister came jogging by and stopped. She recognized Jill Biden and said, oh, it's All Saints Day, right? And she was like, I better tell Joe. So she catches up and tells Joe, and he said, we gotta find a mass. We gotta do this, because he said, my 91-year-old mother's gonna call me this afternoon. First question was gonna be, Joey, you know what today is, right? We're here in mass. He said, I would be able to say, Ma, of course I know what today is. So he went to mass, and the homily was long, and he was 15 minutes late to his own route. Now, he told that story then in part of his stump speech. And of course, so I'm looking over at the National Press Corps, and I'm thinking, this is going to be great. And they're all like, it completely sailed over the head. So he did. In fact, a good friend of mine was his press agent. John Kerry, Deputy Chief of Staff, took a leave of absence, and David Wade, and was Biden's press guy. And I asked him, he said, I talk about this all the time in the press. He's a Catholic. Talks about his Catholicism in his speeches, and the national press didn't. So it's interesting. Now, had Biden been at the top of the ticket, completely different story. I think we would have seen kind of John Kerry episode 2, and he may have responded differently. So I'm a little reluctant to say it's over. I think if you get a Catholic at the top of the ticket, it's going to be interesting, and these issues will be all over the place. Nixon, interestingly enough, was the only guy I saw in the 1960 campaign who raised Article 6, the no religious test. He said the only test here is whether or not somebody is a believer of some kind or another, despite what Article 6 says in the Constitution. And I thought, how extraordinary. And so Nixon said, he's a good guy. I don't criticize Kennedy because he's a Catholic. But it's still inconceivable today to me for a non-Christian to make it to the top of either national ticket. And so in a sense, we have a de facto religious test of a sort. It's just very hard to conceive in the short run, and even either non-Protestant or non-Catholic getting to the top of the ticket in either party. Now, I think it may be more likely in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, but I still think it's a long shot there. So I don't think that issue's been settled. It's still a secular candidate or a Jewish candidate or a Muslim candidate still seem to me to be very far off in our nation's politics. Jim?
Shaun, I had a couple questions for you on a little bit different topic. First of all, I'm a little shaky about your introduction to Christian right back in 1960. And, it looks to me that the people that you're talking about, Billy Graham, National Association of Evangelicals, aren't the people who really get the Christian right going. And some of the Christian right people may have been where they were. But I think the emphasis on the role of mainstream liberal Protestantism in the anti-Catholicism is much more important. I wonder if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that. The other thing I thought, no doubt talk about in the book, but you don't stress here, is the fact that religion was a strength for Kennedy as well, certainly in terms of his electoral success. The fact that he carried 80+% of Catholic voters, which was a very large Democratic bloc, obviously, and a large portion of the electorate, was a very important factor in his ultimate success, and certainly even his success with his Democratic, run for the nomination. You say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, on your first question, if you look and see who was in the room, with POAU, for instance, a huge percentage of POAU were Southern Baptists, which I would argue are, in fact, a lot of the rank and file stock of the religious right. Although those are some of the people that fall well against the drawing in the late 70s and early 80s. So I think in terms of intellectual leaders, your criticism is probably apt, but if you look at the foot soldiers who were there in the local chapters of POAU, the people who attended the dinner at the Mayflower Hotel were Church of Christ people, which is my tradition, Southern Baptist. Those were the folks who were some of the first to sign up in the moral majority in the late 70s and early 80s. So I think the connection is still there. And the Graham folk, I mean, I think some of the Graham folk, and you look at the really interesting guy here who remained a huge shadow is J. Elwin Wright, who in many ways is the father of contemporary evangelicalism. His papers are not collected anywhere that I can find. He's sort of the shadow financier. It would be interesting to see where his folks ended up going when Falwell and the religious right comes on board. Now, in your second question, it is certainly true that Kennedy's Catholicism helped him in many contexts. But you're only talking about less than a quarter of the electorate. So if you win 80% of a quarter of the electorate, you still have a ways to go to get to 50%. And that was the hard part. Getting the Catholic vote was like shooting fish in a barrel for him. But you're only talking about at most a quarter of the electorate in 1960 was Catholic. So you get 80% of that, and you're still 15-20% away from the margins. Gallup's polling showed early on in 58 and 59 that the more Protestants learned he was Catholic, the lower his percentage of that vote went. In the end, what I think saved him was his direct address of the religion problem. I tell the story in the book about the pollsters who come to him on Labor Day. 23% of the electorate's undecided. And the pollster argued, the folks who are going to vote against you because you're Catholic are gone. You're never going to win those folks back. So don't worry about it. Concentrate on this 23% of the electorate that's undecided. And my polling shows that among that 23%, the more you're perceived as a victim of Catholic bigotry, the more that moves them towards you. So start talking up religion. So they took the Houston speech film and they carpet bombed Protestant America with that on TV. They showed how many hundreds of hours that played for free across America. And it's my belief that in post-Labor Day, his embrace of the fact that he was Catholic and was being unfairly maligned actually persuaded the persuadable Protestants who were still on the fence towards him. So in the end, his religion actually made a difference and did help him. Now, then the other question I often get asked is, well, what if he'd been a Protestant? How would the election turn out? And I have absolutely no idea. I don't know.
I have a little bit of inside information on this question because I'm your wife, but I would like to, for some of the folks who are budding writers and authors, can you talk a little bit about the note on one piece of paper that became a huge, that you couldn't decipher originally?
Oh yeah. I got the informant memo that said, here's what Nixon is doing. And it mentioned the operative's name. And one of the things we do archival research, you go to the Cadillac archives, like the JFK Library or Georgetown, where they're finding aids that will tell you in great detail what's in every folder. And so you can decide, I want folder number 842, and they'll go and pull it for you. On the other end of the spectrum of the archives, where somebody's taken the desk of a decedent and dumped them into a file box and donated them to, well, the informant ratted out the operative. And the operative was a former congressman who donated his papers to the University of Missouri. His family did the desk drawer dump. And so I found a memo in the operative's desk. It was a piece of hotel stationery. It wasn't a memo. Hotel stationery with pencil writing on it. And is this the one you might remember? And it said, Can P. Collins question me? Like, well, can P. Collins what? It made no sense to me. And then I suddenly realized, so you go to Google and you start Googling P. Collins and nothing came up. And then I saw it was Carr P. Collins, who was a financier in Dallas, Texas, who ran Texans for Nixon. Multi-millionaire in the life insurance business. And it was Ken P. Collins, $50,000 was the first. And it turned out that was one of the funding sources that this operative had gone to behind the scenes. Southern Baptist was a member of Criswell's Church, in Dallas, Texas. Very conservative Southern Baptist. He was apparently one who helped bankroll this operation. So sometimes the archival work is just the technical. Vince, and we have another question here too.
Shaun, it's been alluded to a couple of times, whether or not Bush went to church, the story with Joe Biden going to church. You know, it's a sad state of affairs if, in fact, we are still, in 2009, judging people or characterizing people because they're in church or out of church.
Amen.
But I'm just wondering, if this played into Kennedy's thinking in his strategy. Obviously, he got elected in Massachusetts because he's a strong Catholic, right? And he's thinking, okay, a majority probably got him to that position. Would that have transposed, or in his strategy, thinking, if I can carry this nationwide, this Catholic Catholicism support, that will bolster me?
In fact, they went the other way early on. There's a story in Wisconsin, when he's campaigning in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, as I understand it, in that day, the Catholic population was concentrated in the cities. The rural population tended to be more Protestant. So his handlers have him scheduled for a town in upstate Wisconsin, somewhere small town, and they did it at a Catholic church. And he pulls up, and all the nuns are lined out carrying Kennedy signs. And, you know, the vocabulary the president-to-be fell into is not repeatable in the family university. And he told his staff, we cannot do that, because his fear was he would be labeled the Catholic candidate for president. So he actually early on decided there's going to be no photo ops with priests, or he's not going to go to Georgetown and make a speech, that they really did not want to play up the Catholic connection, because the fear was that out there in the primary season, and then of course in West Virginia, an overwhelmingly Protestant state, they had a very difficult time, but he eventually triumphed. So early on, no, they really pulled back, but he maintained these communication lines to people like Cushing and Bishop Wright, and you know, John Cogley on the staff. So they felt that pressure very acutely not to come off as the Catholic candidate. But finally, in Houston, he's got to address his Catholicism directly, but at that point, that's a very late hour in the campaign.
Yeah, this comes from a Lutheran minister's son who grew up in the Middle West as a person who saw the Catholic Church more as kind of the stern parent that you rebelled against. And so they knew each other pretty well, and so there wasn't, I think, that kind of hatred or the difference you would have with the evangelicals. But what fascinates me about the use of religion in American politics is how little religion seems to have factored into the lives of, say, the people who used it. Like, in other words, Nixon, his spiritual life was almost zero. You know, that strange thing in Kissinger's memoirs, I guess, where they get down on their knees and he tries to get Kissinger to get on his knees and pray with him. The use of Billy Graham in campaigns a lot. Maybe Jimmy Carter was the only one who really seems to have taken religion seriously. Reagan, someone said, never went to church. His wife used mediums in the White House. It's hard to avoid the feeling that the use of religion in American politics is purely instrumental. Even with Obama, when you ask him, what is your favorite Bible passage, he would always say Matthew 25. Well, this is, again, the use of religion to help the poor and all that, but it's not really a spirituality at all. So.
Yeah, I'm very conflicted. I mean, as I reflect back, well, I would tell my students, that, and this is a Protestant thing, and maybe Catholics are trying to do this too. A lot of Protestants, given two equal candidates, will vote for the churchgoer over the one who doesn't go. And I say, unfortunately, as an ethicist, I would love to be able to say the most moral individual makes the best president or offers the most moral policies. Unfortunately, looking at American history the last 60 years, I can't make that case very persuasively. So I tend not to try. One of the things I think I would recommend to do differently for Obama, for instance, in retrospect, one of the things I'm very uncomfortable with is the bathing beauty pageant aspect of some of the events where we brought people out in serial fashion to talk about their religion. I think it's perfectly permissible for a candidate to get up and say, I'm a devout Catholic, here's how Catholic social teaching has influenced my politics. I think that helps voters understand the mind and thinking of candidates. But where I get nervous is when we bring 3 of them out in a row and question them, and as if it's like, well, okay, were Chet's answers better than Michael's? Or did Michael do a better job than Jim did? As if to say, vote for Mike because he came off a little more pious than I did. I'm uncomfortable with that sort of back-to-back aspect of it. There are ways for candidates to do these kind of media interviews one-on-one where you don't then stack up 4 or 5 people together. I would argue for separating them so you get less of the beauty pageant, comparative content.
So Saddleback was a big mistake.
I don't know if it's a mistake. I'm just uncomfortable because the scorekeepers at the end would say, well, McCain seemed to be more at ease and Obama seemed more professorial and cerebral. Well, that doesn't answer who's going to be the best president of the United States. And that's what troubled me is coming away from that. People seem to say, well, McCain was more comfortable, therefore Christians ought to vote for McCain. Independent of the content of what he was saying. And again, with Romney,
Didn't hurt Rick Warren either, Jim.
no, let me say this. I was in the audience, right? And so Warren comes out, Obama comes out, and later on Warren comes, and then McCain comes out. The largest applause of the night is when Rick Warren came on. Of course. And I wanted to head for the exit. It just sent all the wrong signals to me that this was not a political event, but this was a sort of baptism or something where he was coming out and blessing them. I think Romney's mistake was, Romney preached what we call in preaching business a 3-handed sermon. He said on one hand this, on the other hand that, on the other hand. He said on one hand, I'm an evangelical Christian. I mean, he did market himself as an evangelical, which is a tough sell. Then he said, no, really I'm a Mormon, but there's a limit to what I can tell you. And I disagree with Christology, there's some problems there, and then he got off of it. But then on the other hand, he said, I'm invoking the Kennedy legacy that's all private anyway. And those are mutually exclusive positions, that you're incoherent. So even if you're a Romney supporter. Now, frankly, I don't care about his Christological views. I literally think you can be a great president and be absolutely wrong Christologically. You can be as bad a heretic as we've ever had in politics. Christologically, it can be a great president. And I don't want to vote for Barack Obama over John McCain over Mitt Romney because John McCain's got Christology down right. I mean, that's where we're headed in a lot of our sort of People magazine Oprahfication, if you will, of religion in these campaigns, where people are voting on sort of doctrinal affinity and warmth and things like that. One of the questions I got asked at the Messiah College Companion Forum by a secular journalist, John Meacham, who ought to know better, essentially asked, when did the Holy Spirit make your leg tingle? This is when have you felt the Holy Spirit operate in your life? And he prefaced it with, you're coming out of a Wesleyan Pietist background. And I thought, who cares? What difference can that possibly make to whether she's qualified to be president of the United States? So that part of it troubles me, I think.
I think if we're at the end of questions, I just would like to thank both Chet for being an excellent discussant. This has been an engaging conversation. I mean, down to that, I've rarely seen the level of detail that you put into this, in these kinds of conversations, and also hitting big themes. And also Shaun for both an excellent book and a great conversation today. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure that you